Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning, sir. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. I'm on the East Coast now in Philadelphia, where these will be my new digs for a while. Ray and I are looking for a space outside the city, but it'll still be in this area. So I'll be in the Philly area for a while, and I'm acclimating. It's
All right.
blustery and cloudy, and feels like a
All,
northeast winter already.
all that brotherly love all around.
I don't know that I'm experiencing a whole lot of that yet. I was at the dog park yesterday and experienced a guy and a lady getting angry at each other about how the dogs were behaving, and there was a lot of "go fuck yourself."
Oh,
Not
interesting.
not so much brotherly love, but a fair amount of "go fuck yourself."
Uh-huh. Well,
So
what
yeah,
was it? Dogs, water, and women. The three
uh,
things people get shot over in the West, at least, something like
in
that.
the West, yeah, I've heard dogs were number one, which
Yeah,
was
dogs are right
surprising.
up
Yeah.
in there. It's pretty impressive.
There was no shooting. It wasn't even that acrimonious. It was kind of like you went to
Autopilot.
you went to go fuck yourself as like a level one. That's just kind of getting to know each other.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in New York, and I came there from the Midwest. And it was a gear shift. I wasn't quite ready for the brusqueness of the experience. Let's put it that way. And
I kind of appreciate how little attachment there can be to such a strong statement.
oh yeah, yeah. Well, and I did. It definitely helped me in certain odd ways. Like not odd, but unpredictable ways. It gave me a capacity to operate and to take care of myself. Whereas in the slower and the more Midwest, it was like they were going to help take care of you a little bit. Things were kind of, but in New York, it was definitely, you're going to swim on your own or you're going to drown. And so there was something useful to that. That's also kind of what got me into martial arts also, was like, okay, well, at least I'm going to take some of you with me. If that's what it comes to, you know. But I lost a certain fear of self-expression. So, it's like you're going to have to stand your ground just to be. So, you know, Lord help you if you can't, but it definitely is a thing to learn, I think. And
Yeah.
so,
Well, what I thought we might talk about today, it might be sort of related to that. Maybe we'll see how those reconnect. Um, Over the years, you and I have talked a lot about intuition, and I thought, especially given how much we've been exploring the relationship between the rational and the post-rational, the modern and the postmodern, the call it different ways of knowing that we attribute to objectivity and subjectivity. Um, I thought it might be fun to bring this idea back around because we've had some specific conversations about how one might cultivate intuition. And I think that would be worth sharing with our listeners.
mhm.
But then there's and then where we apply intuition, whether it's dialogue or shamanism or art or um, how we decide what to have for breakfast or all of that. But then there's also what even is intuition? And I think maybe our thinking about that here and as humans in general might be evolving. right.
Yeah,
So
I think so.
I think I'll just float out the topic of intuition. What is it good for? And let's see where let's see where we go.
What is it good for?
Say it
Well,
again.
it's good for a lot, I think, if it functions well. Save your life if it functions well. Um, when you mentioned the word, the first thing that leapt to mind was a quote. I want to say Albert Einstein. I know it wasn't Marcus Aurelius. And he said, reason is a tool, but intuition is a gift from God.
I think
And
that was Einstein.
I think it was Einstein. And I do remember him talking about, and this would be a great conversation to have with Federico Fagin. Um, but I remember Einstein talking about having a visualization from a relatively early age of what it would be like to be traveling in space alongside a beam of light. And if you were to look over next to the beam of light, you're both zooming along at bazillion, dezillion miles an hour. What would it look like? And he talked about having an intuition of what it would look like. And I don't know whether that intuition had come from the slot experiment where diffraction happens, and or where he was getting that intuition, but it seemed like it was the pursuit of that intuition that resulted in his progress in physics. That was the scent that he was on the trail of. And so there is some function that goes on that I think when we talk about intuition, a lot of things get thrown in the basket. I think that, there in that Einstein quote, he juxtaposed it with reason, as if these were the gas in the clutch of insight. Uh, and I think that this is really, really a bigger topic than it seems. We were talking about this whole progress of Western philosophy and this idea of the Enlightenment. And Descartes comes and he says, I'm going to doubt everything except what I can directly experience. And then that turns into, I only am really going to believe in what I can prove to others. So reason sort of represents that provable realm, whereas intuition really can only be proved after the fact. And then usually you would be, the response you'll get would be like, yeah, right. Like, I had one experience I think I might have mentioned before was when I had a master come and visit us from China who was in the Wu style lineage. He had been a direct disciple of Ma Yuliang, a famous Southern Wu style Tai Chi master. And when he left after his first visit, he said, "See you next year." And so I was looking forward to him coming and doing this another workshop, and we had a date for it and everything. And we had a normal procedure that we'd go through whenever a master visited for notifying everybody and getting a space and arranging for putting him up and all those details. And we got to about a month away, and I had really not done anything. And I knew it was coming, and I should have been doing stuff for the past month, but somehow I just didn't do it. And then I get a phone call, and the phone call is from my other friend, Xu Guoming, known as George Xu, Master Xu, who was going to bring Master Wong. And he said, "Well, they diagnosed Master Wong with cancer, and I think he ended up dying very close to the weekend that he was scheduled to teach, that we had scheduled the weekend for here. And on the same weekend, my father died, my adopted father. And so it was somehow those events I felt like when I got that call and when everything started happening, my thought wasn't, well, that was lucky because I didn't do any of the work I was supposed to do. My my response was, oh, that's why I wasn't That's why I wasn't doing any of that stuff, right?
So
S so
so I
so
think it's
that was a
uh,
feel of intuition, but it wasn't anything I could go to the racetrack with, if that
yeah, I think juxtaposing intuition with reason is pretty straightforward. And I think things get murkier when we juxtapose intuition with shadow. So like it would be easy for us to take the story you just told and apply it to all of the situations in which we procrastinate and say, well,
oh,
that's
yeah.
just
Oh, yeah.
intuition. Right.
Right.
So
So there was some
how
different feel. What was that different feel about that?
right.
Yeah. But I think the other thing, in fact, where I thought you were going with the conversation about shadow was how do we sort out the voice of intuition from all the other voices?
Exactly. That is
Yeah.
where I'm going.
Right, right. And there is a taxonomy of voices, if you will. And and I think this is one of the huge ahas for a lot of people, particularly I think it's a conclusion, an experiential conclusion of the shamanic experience, if it happens correctly, and that is that you realize that what plays across your consciousness is not always authored by you, and it's not always authored by or originated out of the obvious visual external world, but it takes some in-depth shamanic experience to see this other dimension of things. Uh, but there is the word we mentioned before we got on today, this idea of intersubjectivity. It's not an objectivity, and yet it has certain objective aspects to it that enable us to work in a way closer to we do in objective reality. But it is intersubjective, and there is an experience of entering into a different place. But this idea of sorting out the voices is a I think that's like a psychological task that we all have to do as we grow up and we mature. Freud had this idea of superconscious, which is like often described as the voice of your parents or authority in your head. And so, yeah, there are these different voices. And I think that this is where know thyself comes in. This is where some bit of self insight, I guess that is insight. We don't need the self, it's redundant. Some type of insight to understand the voices that we are thrown to. Thrownness is a Heideggerian conversation that Werner Erhard recycled and altered a little bit, talking about our being thrown to have certain responses to things, or and that usually that those thrownnesses are intimately connected with our previous experiences and that were formative usually somehow. So one has to know, the cracks that are in your own windshield. You have to know them well enough that you don't mistake them for things on the road. You may not be able to actually repair the windshield. You might just know, well, I have this tendency, I got bit by a dog when I was a kid, so I just feel a little uncomfortable with dogs. But I know that's me and not necessarily the dogs, that sort of thing, right?
And you don't have to stop being uncomfortable around dogs for the awareness to be useful.
Precisely. You're just managing. Yeah. In fact, I think I told the story about the guy who had OCD and how the relationship with the voices in his head changed. Before, if he had the knife drawer open in the kitchen, he couldn't sleep. Well, he couldn't sleep for, not for any physical reason. Most people, drawer open, drawer closed, doesn't make a difference. So why couldn't he sleep? Because of the voices in his head that told him, started a conversation with him about that. When he could sleep with an open box of razor blades on the dresser next to him, he knew he had mastered that voice. And that's why I say this is a taxonomy, because we have to learn how to recognize these things. And then when we hear a certain voice, We know, oh, okay, that's that perennial voice that is the voice of this or that, the voice of my mother scolding me for this, or the voice of my teacher, or
So I want to get a little more precise about taxonomy because I think probably everyone listening could easily get on board with the idea that we might have dozens or hundreds of voices that are essentially ego and superego, and I mean throw it in there too, but in general, not us, right? Not our most fundamental selves, but beliefs and stories that we've picked up over the years and are engaged with in a way that shows up as cracks on the windshield instead of
uh
clear sight.
or that have been broadcasted at us by our culture.
But we've internalized
We've
them.
internalized them, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, they're
And so,
not
yeah, they
always
can come
deep.
from culture in general, they can come from our
Right,
parents, they can come from whatever
right.
experiences.
So they're not
Take
always
all of those
filled with
aside.
deep emotional content. Some of them are just environmental, in other words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, mm, I guess maybe there's a conversation to be had there about what deep emotional content is because, right, we're talking about these inputs also defining our semantic reality. So something like
Right, right,
language, we might not say has deep emotional content, but it circumscribes how we
right,
experience
right.
the world.
I mean,
So
I guess I'm
it's kind of
thinking that
important.
I have messages that are that might be accumulated, like Jung's idea of the anima. So I may have things that are, expressions about the other, the other sex, in that might be really root to my psychological makeup, and I might get a lot of self illumination out of that by opening that up and digging it out.
Even
But
though
I'm
it's
also
not
just
about your own personal traumatic
right.
history.
But a
Yeah.
lot of things I'm just bombarded with, like I remember my teacher Peter had a parrot, and this parrot could talk. But the way that you got him to talk was you would get one of those cassette uh, decks, or a cassette tape that was only a minute long, and you would say into it what you wanted him to say, and then you would just play this to him incessantly all night long. And then in the morning, he was like, "You want a cracker? You want a cracker? You want?" Because all he'd been bombarded with. And our culture has not only does it do that, it has perfected that. And so that's another kind of static, another kind of voice that's not necessarily coming out of your, things that are really fruitful about your mentation, but it's actually cultural download stuff that you may have a very unique or personal response to. But
So
that's my distinction. There's a lot of things, a lot of voices in there to sort out.
yeah. Well, I was going somewhere else, which is take all of those voices and set them to the side. What's left?
First, can you set them to the side?
Fair. But if we're looking to recognize the voice of intuition, like there are certain mechanisms that I think we could point to, like any voice that's telling you reality is black and white in any particular way, right? But that reality is binary, like good, bad, right, wrong, things like that. Those are suspect, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
we remove those voices, and then
Right.
right, we can apply rules and trim down. But where I'm going is intuition the only voice left, or in your taxonomy, are there a set of well, this is intuition and this is my some other aspect of my inner self and this is my
Oh,
authentic self, or
yeah, I don't
like
know that
that
we
kind of stuff.
always know. I mean, I think that we have transrational functions that are not necessarily deep intuitions.
What's the difference between transrational and irrational?
The f the f the That they're the process of a certain type of processing from stimulus. In other words, pattern recognition kind of stuff,
Okay.
hermeneutics. I often wanna say that certain problems are much better solved with heuristics than they are with analytics. And, for what a lot of people, you don't maybe hear that term heuristics a lot. And the idea is that we sort of generate rules of thumb, mental rules of thumb, because we're bombarded with experience more than we could consciously parse.
Mhm.
But we do have a pattern sifting, pattern sieving mechanism that gives us certain tendencies that I wouldn't, I mean, and you could kind of start to toss those into intuition. Uh, but I think that there is a higher type of intuition than that. I think that we don't need a real lot of inner work to get our heuristics functioning. I think those kind of a lot of those come preset, and I think a lot of them we have to be bamboozled out of by people selling analytic methods.
Mm.
I'll just put that
I
out.
was just thinking that the heuristic methods also have cultural inputs or are set up culturally also. Like, we'll recognize certain patterns based on our culture and won't recognize other patterns
Right.
because of a lack of exposure.
Generational intelligence is
Uh-huh.
sometimes installed in those. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, and sometimes we used to call it in the old days in the West, we'd call it horse sense. 'Cause we're pretty sure that the horse doesn't go through a sophisticated analytical process, but he's still kinda he knows what he knows, and they're tricky to fool in their own way, you know?
Mhm.
And, I think I was just reading something they were talking about having proved that animals like dogs and cats, while they can't count, they have they had a name for it. They had a numerosity. Like, they still had a sensibility about quantities even though they didn't have names for the specific numbers, because they still had to make decisions based on quantity as far as what food's worth fighting over and what isn't, and things like that.
Yeah.
And so I think that we do have sometimes vague sensibilities that get tossed in with intuition. Although I think that there is this deeper kind of intuition, you know, like I don't think that intuition always explains itself. Uh, there was one occasion, for example, when I won't go into detail, but when I realized that somebody really needed someone from South America really needed to be in the United States. And I couldn't tell you why, but I did go to extreme measures to get them to the United States. And they were here about a month and then they went blind. And I didn't know they were going to go blind. This was a young person. I didn't see this coming at all. But when they went blind and then they were able to get their vision back because in the United States we had the medical facilities to do that, whereas had they still been in South America, they would have been basically begging blind with a cup on the street. And uh and so when that happened, then I had that same kind of like, oh, aha, that's what that was all about. But there's no way I could have rationalized any of that. And then only post facto did it seem like, oh, that's there was some other reason that I didn't I knew there was some reason, I just couldn't flatten it out to speak it to you. But then when that happened, I was like, "Oh, aha." And so I sort of learned that, and I think we maybe talked about this before, I sort of learned that there is a higher intelligence that we have that we typically don't have access to. And that there are times and places, whether they're karmatic, whether or maybe there are disciplines that can make these things more accessible. But there are times when this knowledge does seem to defy our understanding of it. But you and I both know that there have been telepathic moments that come through a traditional pathway as part of a process, and you know oracles is an old idea. It's a very old idea. And a lot of those oracles used some sort of mind altering substances, I think, to access that. So yeah, I mean, there is this idea that we can do have different states of consciousness, and that some of them are non-ordinary in special ways. Um, and I think that we all maybe get clues to this when it just happens to us. You go, "Whoa, what was that was different about that voice that told me that I just had to happen, or I just had to not do that thing, or I just had to not get on the Titanic, or I just had to not," you know,
Do you think that that cultivating an awareness of the intuitive voice is about more than sifting out the the noise? Like,
you
is
know.
there a proactive way to cultivate that voice also?
I think did we talk about that one sort of experiment that I did about not touching my face with my left hand?
We haven't talked about it here, I don't think.
Okay, you know about it, yeah,
Yeah.
and this is one that I'm hesitant to talk about. And the reason is because I don't want people to most people could hear this all the details and no negative effects, but there's a small percentage of people that might not be right entirely, and that might misinterpret what I'm saying, and that maybe could potentially hurt themselves as a result. And so I'm going to leave the details out. There are and I've explained this to people in person because I kind of can meter them and I can see where they are, and I know they're not going to misinterpret this and they're not going to go crazy with it. But as a martial arts teacher, I have met people who were told, "Don't do this because of this," and then sure enough, they went around and did it. And so that's why some assessment needs to be made before you just pass out all sorts of information. But so I was doing this process, and it was a discipline that comes out of a white ceremonial magic tradition, and it involved making a vow and seeing the different elements of your own consciousness that maybe make you want to break that vow. And so as I went through that process, I became aware of something, the vow that I made. And I think it's very important that it's not anything moralistic. It's just random. So the only thing,
Why is that important?
because the only thing that determines this is your will.
But if it were moralistic, wouldn't things internally also arise to subvert your will to maintain it?
Maybe, but they might just be forces of evil trying to break down morality, right? Or something like that. Whereas this idea, I think, is specifically to focus on your oath. And the only thing that makes this special is that your will has determined that it will be so
Okay.
for no other reason. So this is just about your will and anything that's going to oppose it. And so I think the one that I used was touching my face with my left hand. There's nothing wrong unless, there's some cultures where the left hand is the hand that you use to clean yourself. That's why we shake hands with the right hand traditionally, or some things like that. Uh,
Still not moral though.
but there's no moral reason about it. Yeah, and I think the original implication was purely hygienic, right? So. So I did become aware after doing this, for a while. I did become aware that there was some kind of a little pernicious influence in there that, sure enough, when I wasn't paying attention, it would try to sneak my hand up to my face. And that went on for a while. And then the process gets more intense as time goes on. I'll just say it that way. And I was in the midst of, I think I was teaching a class. So my conscious awareness was definitely focused somewhere else. And as I was teaching or paying attention to that other thing, this pernicious influence started to sneak my left hand up to my face. And all of a sudden, it's about 2 inches away. I hear, air quotes, with my mind's voice, a very loud, very authoritative voice that just said, "Stop." And now I'm like a third person here. I'm watching this thing trying to drive the robot a certain way, and then this voice from deep inside stops it. And I knew that neither of those impulses were the me that were the cogito, right? The I that thinks and therefore the I that is. So so that voice, when I heard that, I was like, "Whoa, Nelly." And it was as if after that voice woke up, the issue was settled.
Meaning you haven't touched your face with your left hand to this day, or what does settled mean?
No, the oath is just for a period of time. And so I can't say that it never won again after that, but the game was definitely different. Let's put it that way. That much I'm totally sure.
And what you mean by that is you had more power.
Yeah, that little what Poe wrote a piece called "The Imp of the Perverse." And I came to associate that pernicious influence that wanted me to break my oath as the imp of the perverse. Poe describes the imp of the perverse as when you're standing on a high place and you look over the edge, that little voice that goes, "Jump." And you're not going to jump, but that little voice, the little imp of the perverse is in there, right? And then he tells a whole story all about that. But there are these pernicious influences, and it should be no surprise that sometimes we're self-defeating, or that sometimes we work at cross purposes to ourselves. Uh, uh, but so there's different things that have people have had relationships with trying to wake up this deeper self. Uh, there's a famous magical ritual that Aleister Crowley did at Loch Ness that was
Hmm.
called the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage. And the point of it is to attain conversation with your holy guardian angel. And so there's the same idea that with the help of your holy guardian angel, you can do some stuff you can't do if you don't have conversation with that force. And so so both of these sort of postulate that there is this aspect that maybe is in our deeper mind that our cogito is the Latin word, right, for I think. That's taken from Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So we're talking about that particular part of you that says, I'm going to get up and go to the store, or I'm that willing self. Well, this no came from something, or this stop rather came from something that was not the cogito. The imp of the perverse that was trying to break my oath, that also was not the cogito. So, what are all these things? I often think of. I was told that Gene Roddenberry, who wrote Star Trek, produced Star Trek, that he was a Gurdjieffian, and that really what we were getting. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but that really we're getting the internal dialogue of one person. That the whole Enterprise ship is one person.
I've heard this model before, but yeah, maybe go
Uh-huh.
through it a little.
That Captain Kirk in the original version was Captain Consciousness, and Bones, the Doctor, that was compassion, and Spock was reason or logic. And the whole show kind of told us that humans have something that Spock didn't have. And that's that conversation that says that reason is just a tool, but this other function is really a gift. And and so uh so yeah, then you have the body, which was Scotty. And he'd say things. I don't know if anybody who's seen that remembers that old. They'd crawl up in these tubes, and there'd be all these sparks, and he'd say, "It feels like ants all over me body, Captain." Right. So all these very physical kind of clues to that. And then we got a whole update with the next generation, where now who went out and did things? It wasn't Captain Consciousness anymore. It was Will Riker, right? he sallied forth to actually do things. And I thought, oh, that's a clever touch. And we also have intuition now that's in the form of Counselor Troy. And so one of the things that Counselor Troy, I thought, and I noticed this from ceremonies also. I had some ahas, and good therapists do this, good Chinese doctors do this. And that is they see a holism in the person that's presented to them. And they they're able to see constellations of details that give them information as opposed to like, oh, there's this and there's this or there like they grab a bigger gestalt somehow. And so so intuition often would show up, for example, in ceremonies to where I would realize, oh, when I was talking to that person, they were actually giving me signals that this or that was the case. Now I see why they were that way. Now I see because I didn't put it together. It was like picking out pieces of a mosaic, or doing archaeology on an old mosaic and picking up new pieces. Oh, that's how they fit together. Uh, so sometimes some intuition is seeing these holes that we don't see when we're hyper focused on the small, on the detail.
It's interesting to me that you went to the interpersonal because that's where I was about to go to, and I think my comment or question is something like, given some of the things we've been talking about lately, in this podcast and offline, um, there are two ideas about intuition that I want to kind of put forward. One is, what do we think about intuition being something that arises through us as opposed to from us? And the other is, what do we think the role is of interdependence and interpersonal relationship in evoking intuition? So, for example, sitting across from somebody in a shamanic context or a therapeutic context, and or in a fight, and asking, "What is that?" Not opening up the opportunity for intuition to arise. So, and
And
then
a learned skill. Yeah,
right, and then the first question is, and if intuition arises, where from?
right. I would have to say that it arises from presence, but it might be presence to the field in the Federico Fagin sense that we are all qualities of this field. And so it's like reading the force, Luke, right? Because you're reading a perturbation in the force. Now I want to talk about Booner, right? And the secret teachings of plants. Uh, we have an electromagnetic field, and all living things generate an electromagnetic field. And all things that have electromagnetic fields will perturb other electromagnetic fields with their field. And all these living things that can uh, that read the perturbations in their electromagnetic fields. Uh, that is, if they can create a perturbation, they can read and translate that perturbation. So I just saw a thing that I saw that was like, wow. And I don't know if it was peer reviewed or what the deal was, but they were saying that if you hook up an EEG to your plant, that the plant can tell when the main caregiver of that plant has left and is on their way home. The plant knows when they're within 2 kilometers of home that their primary caregiver is coming back. Presumably, they experience something like your dog does when you come home, uh, on the plant level. Well, that's a pretty big electromagnetic field. Uh,
Or an interconnectedness of a number of electromagnetic
Non-locality.
fields.
Yeah, could be a non-locality thing. But so that might, a lot of our intuitions might be reading perturbations in the field, And, if a plant can read a perturbation of something, uh, the point is if we haven't translated those skills and capacities into correlates within our semantic world, then they don't exist. The reason that those capacities existed, like going "what" when you're facing an opponent, or "what" when you're sitting in front of a patient in a shamanic setting, is because the setting and the teaching and the training all reinforced and taught you that this could be done. And so it creates a space, an excuse for it to happen in your semantic world so you can then pull it out of the field. I feel like a lot of times when I work talking with people about things that are going on with them, a lot of what I try to do, and maybe you've perceived this, is to try to, you might call it reframing or recontextualizing. I want to change the model a little bit. And the new model wants to have the possibilities for choice in it, the possibilities for perceptions in it that weren't there with the old model. But I can't just throw a whole new model in there. I have to take pieces of the existing model and wire the new model into it like a plug-in so that it's consistent with the worldview that's there. It's just a further refinement of it. And that's why I've said it. Sometimes it's like if I were to come into your house and bang on the wall in a place, a random place, and all of a sudden a control panel were to come down. I mean, you've lived in this house your whole life. You didn't know there was a control panel on the wall because you never banged on the wall exactly that way. And so, look, did you know that there's this and that and this thing that's been here the whole time that you didn't know about? If you do this to it, it'll actually affect these other things. And so it's like again, another page that had been torn out of your owner's manual that now kind of gets installed there. And some people would say, well, that's hypnosis. I don't know. I think that might be a two-dimensional model of what's going on. I prefer to say that it's just adjusting the model.
I'm confused about the reference to hypnosis. Was that as a pejorative? Like that's just people fooling themselves? Is that what you mean?
I think that's how people would consider it. I think now they might also say, "Oh, that's just a hack." And I guess that's the way I think of it, it kind of is as a hack. Because this is kinda how the software works, and so you just need to update this module, that's all. You're stuck
Mm.
on a I don't know, you're stuck on the old, uh, release.
I guess consistently, I mean in every conversation to some extent, but the more let's say spiritually or emotionally significant the conversation, and I use the word conversation very broadly. The more significant the conversation is, the more intentionally I would do this. But I think it happens to some extent in every conversation, not just to me, that when it's our turn to speak, we have to listen internally for a moment before we open our mouths. And the quality with which we do that has a lot to do with what then the quality of the conversation is going to be.
And the richness that we bring to it from our prior cognitive models having been updated and enriched by prior experience or by reading. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So, like in a coaching context, um, it's completely an intuitive process to suggest one or another mental models for how one might reframe whatever it is that's on their mind.
Mhm. Well, it's a lot like, I taught kung fu for years and years, and and I didn't teach exclusively forms. We taught a lot of fighting. And so, which is a very spontaneous, like, let's look at what your reactions are. Let's look at how you go into this. And this is one, the Confucians, I think it was Confucius that first referred to it, and it gets translated as the golden rule. But but technically it means measuring with oneself. And so when I see a student in a particular situation, I have to try I have to try it on. I have to hallucinate myself into that situation and feel what my reactions were. and feel how our models were different. And then to try to give that, okay, well, here's what I do for that. And often there's a few things, not just one. But you're stretching their model of response. You're adding more choice, you're adding more options, and it's almost like, where Harry Potter is going to the train station and he's gotta find, I don't know, gate number 12 and a half or something like that, and the Muggles, they can't see that gate, but it takes this learning how to see it and knowing where to go, and then you can go right through a wall, it seems like. Well, that's exactly, correlate to what some of the things that happen in fighting. So, for example, when an opponent is charging at you, there is a moment, if you're very attentive and you're ready to move, that you can run right in on their attack and be so close, so fast, it just breaks their whole attack. But when you're standing there, it looks like the craziest thing in the world that you would ever do. And if you try it and you're a slice of a second too late, you will get hammered. And that will tend to reinforce the feeling that there's no door there at all. It's just like literally like running into the wall. How did he just go through that? I just tried and I hit a wall. Well, because you didn't hit the window of time where that works is what it turned out. But after a while, when that moment comes, you'll actually feel a suction to that moment because you know that portal's there. Well, now you've got a place on your cognitive map that you didn't have before, or that the other opponent didn't have because he didn't know you could enter right there. And this is like, I think I mentioned before, getting someone to shoot way far over my head by running away, running away, running away. And then when they set their guns for way far where they think I'm going to be, that's what opens the door for me to run right in the middle. But it'll still feel like here's all this momentum coming at me. I'm running right into the railroad train. But this is the idea that there are things that you can do. That's why when I say I'm always looking for the Buddha path, I'm always looking for those little hidden entrances or windows that tell me, okay, this is the way through this. Like like the story I told about grabbing the kid and keel hauling his butt out of the school when he was in the midst of a fight. But then as soon as I let him go, I sent somebody to tell him that I apologized. Well, in that moment, was it intuition? Was it feeling the field? But I had to do something radically different, exactly opposite to what I had just done, which is I had to be very, very yin by apologizing to somebody that I had just very brusquely manhandled. Well, I felt that there was a window there and I had to be in it, right? I had to hit that and I had to hit it with the right quality that is a super yin quality, or I wasn't going to balance the situation out. And maybe post facto, I can analyze it that way, but in the moment, it's a feeling that pulls you, right?
Yeah, you added a couple of things to the intuition conversation that might be self evident, but I think maybe are worth underlining. And one was empathy, I think, where by putting ourselves in someone else's shoes, we expand our vocabulary for what sort of internal listening is possible.
Mhm.
And then the other thing that I wanted to call out is you described being sucked into a moment in the fighting context, but I think this happens in all kinds of situations where if we allow ourselves like I was in an airport recently and I was going down the escalator and coming up the escalator on the other side was somebody with a walker who had gotten it stuck along the side of the escalator and was in the process of falling backwards in slow motion and rolling down the escalator. And I got sucked into helping them. where if I had stopped to think about, well, should I help them, or what would helping them even look like? Before I had a chance to have any thoughts, I was running down the down escalator and back up the other. And there is a thing about, and there's a Tarzan between the vines connection to this too, of like knowing when to let go and what vine to grab onto, um, not coming from a rational
And
place.
flow with the moment.
Yeah, and
Mhm.
those are all facets, I think, of
I saw a
intuition.
great example of that on a video, and it was from China, I think, and there was a guy with a meat cleaver. I mean, like a chopper, and he had this chick by the neck, and he was threatening, and there was a circle of people around him, and they're all in the, "Oh, what do we do?" And it was a standoff, right? And a guy shows up, and you could see it all. He goes in, he reads the situation. He's a new element in there. His presence changes it. While everybody's going, who, wah, wah, he felt the moment. He flowed right into it. He got right in under that arm as the guy was threatening with the cleaver. He just went right with the moment. He grabbed that arm and he did a beautiful judo throw of this guy. I mean, head straight up or feet straight up over his head and captured the captured the cleaver, and the girl ran off, and it was just poetry in motion. It was more beautiful than a ballet scene. I mean, it was like, because it was exactly that. He felt the moment and he flowed into it. I've seen a few videos of these, but when you see it, you know it because it's just perfect. It's just flawless. It's just, and in a martial arts sense, that's what we're after, you know?
Not just martial arts, I think life.
Well, of course.
I
Yeah.
so are there is there more to be said about how we might increase the frequency or the probability or both of those experiences?
Well, that's why we have a dough. That's why we try to drop the microscope on a field that limits the variables. And that's what martial arts is. That's what flower arranging is. That's what calligraphy is. It's what a lot of these doughs are some way. We say there's a thing in here that if you get it right, boy, it's just extraordinary. But you're not gonna get it every time. And you're gonna keep trying. And then, maybe it starts out at 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100, but that's enough for you to know, oh, there is something to that. And then slowly your percentage comes up and this is where people can do amazing things. This is like we mentioned before, the Zen archery master who could split the arrow at night when he can't even see the target. Right, this is where these like transcendent things, and here's another chapter from the Book of Lies. Right, do a thing 100 times and it becomes difficult. Do it 100 times, 100, or do a thing. Yes, it becomes difficult. Do it 100 times, 100 times, and it becomes easy. But do it 10,000 times, 10,000 times, and you no longer do it, but it does itself through you. And only then is that which is done well done. Thus quote Frater Perdurabo as he leaped from boulder to boulder, never casting his eyes on the ground. See, for him, the dough was in mountain climbing, and it's called the mountaineer.
Mhm.
And but that really does apply, and we use that to talk about what you're doing when you're practicing. Do a thing. All right, and I hope I have that right. Do a thing 100 times, and it becomes difficult, or it becomes difficult, as if when you begin, there's no distinction between right or wrong, but then when you start, you start to see, okay, there's a thing to do it right, and now it's become difficult. And then you keep going, and it's like guitar playing, of course. And then you keep going, and you go past it, and you get to the point where now it's easy, but you're still doing it. But then you get to this other place, this breakthrough place, Like, I remember watching Joe Pass, the great jazz guitarist, play from about 15 feet away, and he was totally in that it's doing itself through him, and to the point where he is just as much of an observer as the rest of us, it seems like, you know. So yeah, there is something about that that I think we can get to those moments. I think that the foundation of it is seeing the prints, seeing the footprints, and just hearing about it or hearing about these things. That qualifies as seeing the footprints. But then after you know that the footprints, the things out there, now you have to kind of start searching. And then at some point you'll see the bull. You won't necessarily be close to catching him yet. There's a few steps left, but there's that process, right? And then at some point you'll catch him. Then at some point you'll tame it. And then at some point you will transcend that. And that's this process of, yeah.
I
And
think I
Lao Tzu
found
says,
the Crowley quote. What I came across reads, "Practice 1,000 times and it becomes difficult. 1,000 thousand and it becomes easy. 1,000 thousand times 1,000 thousand, and it is no longer thou that doeth it, but it that doeth itself through thee."
yeah, yeah. So I got the gist of it there.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, for sure.
yeah. A
Um,
few more these and thous, but
I really like these and thous, I have to say.
yeah, it adds a flavor.
Yeah.
For sure.
Maybe before we go, there was one other example of intuition that I thought might be fun to kick around a little. And you and I have talked about, like, if you don't know what you want to do about something, you have a decision to make, then one thing you can do is leave it with your unconscious, say overnight,
Mhm,
and see what you wake up with, right?
mhm.
Um, a friend of mine also was just telling me that she didn't know what to name her child. And so she asked her higher self what to name her child. And she had a dream that night with angels blowing trumpets and the flag with the name on it coming right across the screen.
Nice.
And she woke up knowing exactly what the name was. Um, so there, so there's like a, I don't know if we would say just asking the unconscious, is that the same as arousing intuition? But certainly there's an overlap. And
Yeah,
I was wondering if you had anything to add to that.
yeah. Well, I do that a lot, and I think that that's part of the genius of procrastination is that, I do have a picture of the unconscious mind that it can work that way, and I think it comes from Carl Jung. He wrote a thing at some point, it's probably in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, I'm guessing, um, where he would do these visualization exercises or guided meditations, you might call it. And he would imagine like a step, a stairway going down into the ground. And at the bottom of the stairway was a door. And he would imagine the symbol for whatever was the thing that he wanted to understand more about on the door. And I think where I heard this first was through a book called The Inner Guide Meditation, and he had taken it from Jung. And he talks about doing that, and so you put on there Mercury. You want to know what's the energy of Mercury. You put the symbol for Mercury on the door, and then you open up the door and you go in and you see what experience you have. And uh, I have had this idea of the unconscious as a door that we can't really see beyond, but we know that somehow things pass through. And so I often think of the idea of leaving something at the door and then come back later and maybe the answer that you know was involved with the thing that I left, maybe that answer or a new vision or a new gestalt will click for me when I come back. Or when I'm building something, for example, the stairway in your house that is still unfinished, I believe. I didn't figure out the details when I designed that space, but I figured out that I would be able to figure it out in the future. And I didn't know exactly how I was gonna figure it out, but it was one of those things that I knew that if I left it, it would cook a while. And so then when Isaac was asking, "What about that stairway?" And I'm like, "Well, here's how you're gonna have to feel your way into the problems and figure out what's first and what's second and what's third about it." But again, I knew that this was within the realm of that process, but I also knew that I was gonna have to have it reveal itself in the midst, right? With my hands on. I would have to use some hands-on knowledge to do that. And so I do think that there is a way that we can leave things for our deeper mind to ponder, and we may find that things arise in their own time. And part of it is maybe just believing that that process works, you know? And because I think it works unconsciously, but when we make it conscious and we start to try to employ it, uh, I think that we get a whole nother realm of feedback then, and I think that I think you're right that all artists maybe do that to some extent. Um, for me, it actually turned into uh, just a version of problem solving. And I really like problem solving because of that, because I don't know. And it is going to have to come from somewhere. And there is that inner dialogue of, you know, and then excuse me, there's ahas along the way. And those are really fun, you know. And the reconception when the new gestalt of something clicks in and you're like, oh, of course, put that on top you know? That's why I like Brian Eno's, deck of oblique strategies. Shout out to Brian Eno, today's rock and roll reference. Brian Eno of Roxy Music and ambient music and all the rest. Uh, and that's a fun thing too, is the oblique strategy deck, which is something you can find online. And it's just, when you're stuck, you draw one of the cards. And I actually have an app on my phone that has the oblique strategies. And it'll tell you something interesting always, like take what's on bottom and put it on top, or forget about the strong parts, or I mean, there's just a bunch of them.
It's kind of like a shortcut through the I Ching.
Well, in the experience of the I Ching, yeah, there's some great things. Carl Jung wrote an introduction to the bowling inversion, which I highly recommend. And the gentleman that helped him with that was a sage in his own right. So the commentaries on the I Ching in there are chef's kiss. Um, so so that also like by what means does this work? Carl Jung came up with this idea of synchronicity. And it was based on first person experiences that he'd had. And I think in a lot of these things, all we have are the first person experiences to try to piece together because we're in a pretty subjective realm now. And um, so so yeah, I mean that's a big piece of things. Is a certain quietness that these voices can be heard
Mm.
in the first place, and and also an openness to understand. And this is my one string banjo tune here is that the cogito, the I that thinks, is not the only dimension of the I. And these dimensions that literally, we're going to be talking about this a lot more in the future, I think. This idea of the other and the infinity of the other, the unplumbableness of otherness, right? Well, we are everyone else's other, and we are unplumbable to them as well as to ourselves. And this is part of that infinite dimension where personal space translates over into collective space. So So, and intuition may well have to do with tapping into that collective. Jung had these dreams of rivers of blood and bodies and all these things a couple of times, I believe, right before the outbreak of the World War. And so there are things that happen in the collective unconscious, and there are portals, but we only see through a glass darkly when we try to work that.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think intuition, which might go by some other names, um, might come back around quite a bit as we continue kind of, um, I
Well,
would say,
intuition.
exploring the utility of a set of mental models for making sense today, right? I think there's conversation to be had about why is intuition so important today that we can
Mhm.
get to in future conversations. So
Yeah.
I think this was a great introduction.
And intuition and its connection to revelation,
Right.
which is an interesting topic when we put it in the context of Western philosophy trying to find something to put a foundation underneath ethics or aesthetics or politics even, you know. Um, so and the role of metaphysics or the role of first philosophy, all of those. And the role of metaphysics as first philosophy will get challenged. Stay tuned to hear that story. We do have some great guests coming up in the future. I probably shouldn't have waited until the end to say this, but we do have some professors of philosophy from various flavors and various focuses that we're going to be talking with in the future to try to add dimension to the conversations that we've been having. And while all our episodes do stand alone, they also work together as a mosaic. So that I trust that over time, a larger view will sort of be conveyed from the collection as opposed to just the specific incidents episodes. So
Yeah, indeed. Good. Well, obviously to be continued.
for sure, we'll see you next time, everybody. Bye bye.